Yeah, there's a sense of real that the rest of us, by many of these folks at least, that the rest of us are really held in real disdain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that they are, they're magnificent somehow, and the rest of us aren't. And so there is a kind of component to this. It's not, I mean, I try to stress this in the book, both for the earlier projects in the 60s and 70s, but also for a lot of the projects happening today, which you've talked about on your program. This is not just about tax havenry and hiding money and so on and so forth. They have tons of lawyers. They can find ways to hide their money. It's not that hard. I mean, it really is an ideological project. And it's a project that's embedded in different kinds of deeply flawed ideas about humanity.
Well, maybe we can go back to some of those projects in the 60s. I know that was like basically the heyday for some of this stuff. Oh, crazy 68, big year for radicals of all stripes. Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, 60s and early 70s was a really fantastic time period for people of all political stripes to leave maybe the place that they were living and join an ill-advised trek, or perhaps a commune, or maybe even a People's Temple somewhere out in a remote area, and where things eventually go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the things I try to stress is that it's the rise or the sort of heyday of the New Left, but it's also the heyday of this kind of libertarian right. And as much as we remember it as the age of Aquarius, we could also remember it as the age of Atlantis. Atlantis is the touchstone kind of symbol for the libertarians of the 60s and the 70s. And it really is a kind of age of Atlantis. There's a multitude of these kinds of projects. Some of the earlier ones, one I mentioned in passing that, always gets a good laugh, is Ernest Hemingway's younger brother, Lester Hemingway, who in 1964 took a raft and attached it to a Ford engine block and anchored the raft off the coast of Jamaica in what was international waters, and essentially declared that he had just created New Atlantis, and half the raft was New Atlantis, his own sort of private country, and then the other half he encouraged birds to defecate on it, and then ceded it symbolically to the United States under the 1856 Guano Islands Act. And so there's this kind of, this one is very humorous. Yes. And Lester Hemingway, clearly felt like he lived in the shadow of his brother.
Yeah. So also, also blew his brains out too.
Yeah. So I think that's right. He was very ill late in life, in the early 80s. That's right. I think he also ended his own life. That's right. But then you have subsequent projects. There were a couple of projects that I look at very briefly that, happened around Florida and so forth. And I won't go into detail about those. But Werner Stiefel, who was a soap engineer, a pharmaceutical engineer, whose family had fled Nazi Germany and lived in upstate New York, he attempted to create in the Caribbean on a ship, on a kind of barge, a New Atlantis. And then the person who I look at quite closely, Michael Oliver, who was Jewish from Lithuania, the only person in his immediate family, to survive the Holocaust, and moved to Nevada and set up a land company and a gold and silver exchange company, and became fairly wealthy in the 1960s, and was quite concerned by what he saw happening around him, understandably so. I mean, he was quite attentive to how the political situation for him could turn at any point. And so he began to think about how one might start a new country. And he wrote a little book called A New Constitution for a New Country. And it became a kind of underground bestseller, and inspired a lot of fairly wealthy people to invest in his projects. And they would become investors that would span the 1970s. From 1968 to 1980, there's a series of projects that Oliver engages in. And so he essentially has these backers working for him, right, and funding him at that time.
So I know with Oliver in particular, he starts something called the Phoenix Foundation, which seems to be sort of the main funding mechanism, in the way that, as we talked about in a previous episode, Pronomos Capital seems to be for a lot of the sort of like goofy neo-reactionary versions, or not goofy, but sort of depressing
kind of
neo-reactionary. Goofy also. Yeah, you know what?
It's like
Fair
a sad
enough.
goofy.
NFTs. If NFTs loom large in your political project, then I'm sorry, it's definitionally goofy. But the Phoenix Foundation seems to be sort of his fundraising and coordination mechanism for a lot of the projects that Oliver engages in, and I found that such an interesting name for a foundation. I mean, namely because, as I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit, several members who are involved in at least one of the projects were veterans, or at least adjacent to the actual Phoenix project in Vietnam, which was the project of assassination and torture on suspected, North Vietnamese agents in South Vietnam. Yeah. But it also seems to also carry with it the very obvious symbolism of death in sort of a fiery way, and then rebirth from the ashes, which is kind of typical of on-the-nose libertarian symbolism. But yeah, I mean, Oliver's career trajectory and all of this, I think, is really fascinating, because he seems to be both the most energetic of the people who are engaged in these projects, and also seems to have gotten the furthest.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think his project certainly got the most attention. And Reason magazine, that comes out of the Cato Institute, and probably the most important libertarian, sort of broad-based libertarian magazine.
Yeah, we're number one subscribers.
Our sponsors,
obviously.
Our sponsors, yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein.